Thank you, Max, for having me here again after last month's Transport Management Asia. Welcome everyone. I will be talking today about different types of transport management strategies and how some of our customers deploy them, for what kind of purpose and for what kind of benefits. So please remember to ask your questions at the screen below. I will answer them right after my session. So I will briefly introduce what kind of types or flavors of transport optimization strategies we have on the market, what's possible, and how you can deploy them in which kind of scenarios. And then I will give you these examples from COFCO, from Carrefour and Lesaffre. And I will close with the brief introduction about oTMS. So transport optimization, general term. In our experience, we think we meet with 6 different types of optimization that you can deploy either together, like some of our customers, or some of them are more relevant to your cases. I mean, you can imagine this as a sort of kind of a tree, and the analogy is basically that some of the fruits are maybe more juicy and more reachable by more type of enterprises in more scenarios. Some are more difficult to reach and not necessarily as promising as you might have been thinking of. And like in this chart, basically, I categorize this transport optimization strategies along complexity, frequency, and the impact size. So like the green ones on the left side, I would say there's something that is sort of like low-hanging fruit. For example, optimizing your freight tariffs. It doesn't sound very maybe sexy or very technologically advanced, but in our experience, at least in China, it can bring several percentage points one-off with a simple one-off project versus, for example, things like routing or load building, which might sound very exciting, but there are, at least in a current commercial environment here, in I think most developing markets, they may be not that applicable to most of the customers and also not that easy to implement. So this presentation is too short to go into details of each one of these strategies, but I will, like I said, walk you through first, actually also using the tree analogy, maybe through like a decision tree, how and when you can actually implement them. And I will show you how our customers are doing this in next slides. So starting with the left slide in this, let's say, decision tree, of course, it's simplified, is, the first question is, do you outsource your transport? I think in 99% of cases, the answer is yes. Then definitely you are using some kind of freight tariffs. And in most cases, they're probably made in Excel spreadsheets several years ago with a build-up of various ad hoc fees and special scenarios. It's generally easy to look at this as a tactical project to review against your existing shipment profile, geographically, weight-wise, order types, and so forth, where basically we can, like I mentioned, see multiple cases where you can achieve 2, 3, 4, even 5 or more % if you are actually able to adjust it to the format that suits your business now more and is maybe simpler and more automated. It can benefit you also with easier bidding, for example, to the carriers. So the next question you can ask, do you use multiple sales channels? For example, if you're in consumer market, obviously you are leaning more and more towards all kind of flavors of e-commerce. You are using more parcel, the shipments getting smaller, so you might be using parcel, road express. On the other hand, you might be, for cost saving, moving for the very large shipments just from trucking to for example, rail, coastal feeder, river shipping. Again, together with freight tariff adjustment, you might look at adjusting transport modes to, for example, take an advantage of what are the offerings available now on the market, because the situation, especially on the express side, is very dynamic. And there are more and more carriers coming up with more attractive price structures. The third question, do you work with multiple carriers? I mean, for most large shippers, the answer is yes. Now, the issue is that mostly you will already have a very pre-allocated fixed territory for each of these carriers. So for example, North China for carrier A, East China for carrier B, and carrier C does South China. What we actually advocate is to use basically multiple carriers on the same territory. That creates a very competitive situation, but also what you will see from the optimization point of view, from the optimizer strategy, I will show you in an example later, almost always selecting more than one, even the lowest cost carrier on a given territory will give you eventually lower cost, and not to mention it will give you more resilience and more leverage over carriers. The next question, if you're a larger shipper, you definitely use multiple ship from locations, multiple plants, multiple warehouses. Typically, you will have the same SKUs spread over multiple warehouses. Of course, the more dense the network, the more opportunities to actually more dynamically adjust the ship from location for a specific customer, especially when we care not only about the lowest transport cost, but of course also the quickest order fulfillment. Extreme cases are scenarios like O2O, where, for example, one of customers is using 6,000 stores to fulfill e-commerce orders from the customers. So in that kind of scenario, of course, you can benefit also a lot from more dynamically allocating the ship from location. So both carrier allocation and shipping location can be done as a project, for example, once a year or maybe once a quarter. Or can be embedded with the day-to-day operation workflow, for example, on your TMS, where basically this allocation is dynamic. And finally, the most extreme case is more like daily automation. I say it's applicable maybe to a limited number of customers, typically customers who may run their captive fleet, like no outsourcing, obviously like express companies. For last mile delivery, or even it's a franchise network, it's still basically, I would say, a captive fleet where you run trucks at a certain dedicated cost, or customers who pay their carriers for a kilometer driven by different truck size or by ton. They generally can then, they will benefit from both load and routing optimization. Why it's limited? Because there's not many customers, at least what we see in China, that work in this kind of commercial structure. You need to change this commercial structure to fit to, let's say, this kind of optimizer to get further savings. And that step is not always easy to make by the customers. So let me walk through practical application of these strategies on different customers. First, let me start with Lesaffre, that is the largest yeast manufacturer globally and one of the top 3 here in China. This is the example of the company that is actually utilized multiple strategies over time to optimize not only their cost but also their service level. So originally they actually wanted just the TMS to run their existing operation to improve the transparency, but they were actually working with a single carrier over years. So they had actually very little leverage over this carrier in terms of cost and service improvement. So then essentially engaged us on more like a 4PL service. And one of the first things we did was, like I mentioned, the lowest hanging fruit in a year 1 was actually look at their historical shipment data and see, can we optimize the tariff? Can we optimize the transport mode? And the answer was yes. In a year 1, I mean, in the first basically few weeks of this project, we found 4.7% saving just from changing the freight tariff and transport mode structure. The overall saving in year 1 was 20%, but that's actually including, of course, the classic purchasing exercise, which is not a topic of, let's say, optimization engine. In a year 2, we reached further 13% savings over year 1. But then here again, of course, the savings from the bidding were already more reasonable, were limited, let's say, to 5%, including the multi-carrier allocation for the same territory. So that actually contributed a large part of this, let's say, 5% saving. Otherwise, there would have been no saving, most likely, if we just selected a single carrier for each RDC. So here in the year 2, we use a shipping location optimization as a main cost-saving driver. So the whole presentation that was actually delivered by Benjamin Tellier from Lesaffre on a previous Transport Management Asia, December 10th. You can see this in detail. Today, I'm just going to focus on these 2 examples of how the optimizer works. for example, for multiple carrier allocation. So here you see the screenshot. The topic given to the optimizer was, the vendors have submitted their bids in the RFQ. There were 8 vendors. And we said in this example for Shanghai RDC, which is a medium size, a smaller DC, we want actually 2 carriers, and 2 carriers should have more or less the same volume allocation between 40-60, 60-40. And their optimizer tell us which 2 carriers should get this business. And then you have 3 different scenarios. You can go like extreme, so always the lowest shipment cost wins, or you can make it a little bit more static, either by route or by province. So you can see, like, compared to the baseline, if we go like complete lowest cost mathematically possible, that's 21% saving with 2 carriers. I mean, not with 8 carriers, with 2 carriers that will be contracted for the service. That's generally very extreme, at least in China. So you would at least do that by route, so by city in this case. That's 17%. So you see the trade-off of 4% for this, let's say, more feasible approach. Or you can go in a very traditional way where you can save only 15%, and then each carrier has their own province, which is very much like a working method in a transport industry. And then in this slide, what I said earlier, that multiple carrier allocation for same territory, in most cases, except for when there is one very, say, predatory carrier that bids very low, not like in this case. Of course, if you manage your procurement well, you won't have this kind of situation. You will have several more or less equally competitive carriers. Like here, out of 8, at least 4 are more or less on the same level. But you can see in this chart, if we would have selected only a single carrier, no matter like the lowest cost, for example, vendor 4, this cost would be still higher than the optimized solution with 2 carriers. That's because the optimizer will find either different routes, provinces, or shipments, where naturally each carrier has different strengths. If you go for 3, you maybe have even lower cost, but maybe the volume on this specific DC was not big enough to justify that. So yeah, this is an example how the optimizer can work on allocating multiple carriers on the different territories and how the savings would look like. This is an example from the same tender, but actually on a different RDC, where there's a 3 times larger. That's their CDC in Hefei. And then, of course, we are, of course, suspect for quite some time if we relocate it. I think that the intention, the original calculations was Zhengzhou was a better location. There will be a saving. That's, of course, a classic network redesign story. But here it was actually combined with route allocation, or the ship to point allocation to a different DC. We have also done the overall reallocation based on the historical data, and maybe that this shippers, so these consignees are better served by a different DC. So then again, the optimizer can give you different scenarios. You can see the very large saving by moving the RDC, and I think in around 10 or 15%, so about 40% of this number is actually based on the route reallocation, not the DC allocation, because obviously DC we wouldn't be reallocating very often, right? But to reallocate the customers between different DCs, that could be done very often. As you know, the customers don't really care where they are getting deliveries from, and it's just basically a matter typically of the system settings. This is more tactical approach, done in this case annually, and will be revisited every 6 months. Here is an example of a customer that we developed the system that actually does this allocation every day. So COFCO is, as you can probably know, it's the largest, if not one of the largest, of the food manufacturers and distributors in China. We work with 2 business units, rice and oil. So cooking oil is the largest manufacturer in China. You can see the sheer size of their network, right? Is mind-blowing. 135 shipping locations, so 57 plants, and about 80 DCs serving 20,000 customers, 700 SKU for oil, over 20,000 tons a day. So the network is very dense, and as you can imagine, of course, the SKUs are shared between different warehouses. And yeah, if you would just consider only the lowest cost, of course, there would be very, very permanent, let's say, allocation. But they often, of course, out of the stock, or the customer has a very short timeline. So they have the planners that actually manually plan now which DC should ship from, considering the inventory, considering the production plan, what's going to be manufactured, considering the order lead time, and of course, considering the transport cost. Huge workload. And of course, on that scale, you can imagine, even we trust the operator that he's doing the good job, but we don't know what's the optimal solution. It's impossible for a human to calculate it. He just uses his experience, makes the allocation based on some, let's say, common sense logic, right? So the idea here was to build the optimization engine that will actually take all these variables into account and will speed the result. It's very complex from the technological point of view, relatively complex. But once it's implemented, the benefit is it's actually very easy to operate on a daily basis, because it doesn't impact any relationship with the carriers. It takes away the workload. So again, without going too many details, but the general idea here is that between this customer ERP and the production system and the execution system, our TMS that's been implemented for several years, we built basically the optimization engine, which as I mentioned, takes both the inventory level as well as the upcoming production plan, and then pre-qualifies a certain range of ship from location based on maximum cost and maximum lead time, and then presents basically the recommended solution, including the ranking of the top 3 or 4 solutions for this SKU, which is then been sent to SAP, and then the decision maker, basically the operator there, makes a decision which one to choose, including some maybe other considerations that not necessarily from the system, and then the actual shipping order is being generated. So the advantage also of this tool is not just doing this process, but actually providing the report on an ongoing basis, what were the optimal system, let's say, indicated cost possibilities and the actual shipping costs, because of course they used to need to still make some trade-off. So the saving is not just static, but you can actually take this feedback and over time either improve your production plan or your decision-making, let's say, decision-making process to actually minimize this gap. But even that, within the first 3 months, the savings are actually staggering on this. You can imagine on this freight scale size, saving over 6% compared to the cost per SKU from the previous 3 months period. I mean, it's really impressive, and of course the ROI from this kind of system is very positive. Finally, let me talk about Carrefour. That's been our customer also for about 3 or 4 years, well before acquisition by Sonning. So as I mentioned earlier, routing, load optimization and routing, it's sort of limited to a very specific scenarios, but Carrefour is actually a good scenario. A hypermarket is a good scenario where such system is not only possible, but actually necessary. So they have over 200 hypermarkets, 50 supermarket size Carrefour Easy stores, 200-300 truckloads a day. So you can imagine it's just saving 2, 3, 4 trucks is already quite significant financial amount, 2,500 to 5,000 pallets a day. So here, originally when we signed actually a TMS contract, we have basically agreement with the dedicated route optimization software provider. And eventually we actually ran the proof of concept with 4 different optimization engines available on the market, both local, Chinese, and also international. Eventually, we had to decide to develop our own system. It's not because the systems were not capable. Actually, on the contrary, they were capable to deliver much better savings, but that would require Carrefour to actually ease up a lot of, let's say, commercial and operational constraints. I mean, the way the contracts are made with the carriers, and also the way that maybe the warehouse operation works, it didn't really very easily yield to, let's say, the optimized or minimized kilometers driven or trucks driven by the kind of, let's say, professional solutions. We have to work with a little bit more pragmatic constraints, such as specific freight rate structure with the carriers, which was not kilometer driven, such as specific pre-allocated stores to a specific carrier, so you cannot build actually optimal routes, and let's say certain processes on the warehouse handover that also limit a little bit the way you can actually create the load. But anyway, the idea here was to make the basically within their existing constraints, make a very automated process, make sure that the result is always objective. It's not down to a human sitting in a DC, or often actually done by the carrier themselves. So the multiple constraints. I would say the software at the end is very simple. The savings are, according to the customer, between 2 to 3%, which is already actually very good. They could have been maybe 5-6% with the professional route optimization software. But again, at that time, at least the decision was made by the customer that they would not be worth, or they were not being prepared to make the other changes that would result in this saving. I mean, definitely the financial result at the end would have been better, but at least back then, this was not a priority. That might happen in the future. So yeah, that's it. And very briefly about oTMS, I think as you can get it from our name, we are the predominantly transport management software system. We basically innovated cloud-based, mobile-based software as a service TMS in China 8 years ago. Since then, we have handled over 400 million shipments for more than 100 large customers. You can see we work with customers of like Fortune 500 size across multiple sectors. Our network includes over 7,000 carriers and 400,000 active drivers. And you can engage us either as a software provider, so that's a SaaS, or you can engage us as a 4PL or a consulting service provider, where we can do, for example, what I mentioned is lower hanging fruits of the transport optimization, so freight tariff optimization, transport mode optimization, carrier allocation. This kind of things don't necessarily need to be done by the software. They can be done as basically as a consulting or as a 4PL kind of projects. So thank you very much for listening, and look forward to your questions, and feel free to contact me on a one-on-one basis if you'd like to discuss more. Thank you, and thanks for listening. Goodbye.